we are live. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on this Friday. We are so unbelievably grateful to have Ashley Fielding with us, who is a pediatric physical therapist, talk about physical therapy, the benefits of it, and also just early intervention as a whole. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here.
Thank you so much. The best way to start this is to just ask an overview of your career. What drew you to the field of physical therapy, and maybe what's your connection to Hope for HIE?
So as a kid, thought I wanted to be a veterinarian, realized some of the things veterinarians had to do were up my alley. I was really interested in becoming a pediatrician or something, working with kids in the medical field, possibly. In high school, I had to do a project about a career that I had never heard of or hadn't really known anything about. We had a family friend that was a physical therapist, and I got to shadow her and learn more about that. She didn't work in peds. She worked with the adult population, but it was awesome. I was like, yes, this is so interesting. I love learning about the body and movement, helping people, improve their function and just participate in life. So right out of high school, I knew I wanted to get into kinesiology, pre-PT, and that's what I got my degree in, and then got into PT school as soon as I graduated. It was in PT school through our pediatric course, as well as my pediatric clinical rotation, that I really was like, I want to do pediatrics. Pediatrics wasn't a requirement. We have to do different settings, but it was a choice. And so some people chose, a different choice for one of them. I chose pediatrics and loved it. So my last clinical was pediatrics, and took a little break to get ready for my exam and started right away in pediatrics with that same company. And I'm still with them today. I've been a PT for a little over 11 years, and I've been in pediatrics the whole time, and I love it. I do early intervention and school-based services. We also contract a bit with some insurance carriers as well as some private pay. And as far as my connection and how I heard about Hope for HIE, I actually have 3 little boys, not so little, my oldest. He will be 9 this summer. And he had a very traumatic birth that resulted in an HIE diagnosis, and he went through the cooling protocol. And at that point, I had been practicing as a PT for about a year and a half. And so I was already a PT working with kiddos before this happened. And and so in my search for finding people to connect with and, looking to find information about what's ahead for us, what's going to come. But since, as we all know, when this happens, you're not given answers about what's going to happen or what's going to come. It's kind of like we have to wait and see, which I'm not a wait and see person. I don't like surprises. So during that search, I found Hope for HIE, and was really searching, just to connect with people. I mean, I think in life in general, we're all seeking ways to connect, and especially in trauma and grief, you're really needing someone to connect with. And I, thank goodness, found Hope for HIE and have met amazing people through that organization. And one of the silver linings is one of our closest friends is actually a family. We happened to connect through the Facebook group, and they lived 5 minutes down the road from us.
Oh, great.
Of all places, I was just looking for anybody in California in general, and they happen to be 5 minutes down the road. And we're still very close with them. We have a very close bond. So yeah.
I'm so glad that you were able to find that support that you needed. And that represents, I think, so many people's stories. We just did a Q&A last week about managing guilt, and everyone, the main takeaway was no one prepares you. No one tells you you're going to experience this. And so it's so helpful to have just people who understand what you're going through. And we're so grateful for people like you in the medical field who can give us some insights and answers too, especially when it comes to like the power of physical therapy and early intervention. So thank you. And that brings us to really our first official question, which is, why is early intervention so important? Why is it so highly encouraged, especially in the HIE community, in your professional opinion?
So the biggest thing that came to my mind with this question is the term neuroplasticity. I know it's a medical term, but a lot of us, I think, have heard it or read about it. I actually have a quote from a book from a PT that I really, really love. Her name is Karen Pryor. There's a book called 10 Fingers, 10 Toes. And when you're talking about neuroplasticity and a baby or a child's brain or anybody's brain, really, this applies to adults as well. But babies are really in that prime time for neuroplasticity. And she says, think of the infant's brain as a roadway being built. Neurological pathways begin as a rough trail. Increased traffic on these trails create more defined paths. These paths develop into roads, and the roads develop into a high-speed highway. So the development of these neurological pathways depends completely upon that reinforcement and frequency of using these connections. So with neuroplasticity, the baby's brain, child's brain, they have the ability to make new connections, to make new roadways. And the earlier you can start, the better. We all have neuroplasticity, but there's a very sensitive time frame from birth until 5 years old where it's highest. And early intervention, is birth to 3 typically is what we see. And so being able to capitalize on that and help the brain make those connections is one of the biggest things. I don't like using use it or lose it. I mean, it's true, but what I really love is, and I heard more recently, was use it and improve it. So we're just trying to help reinforce those connections and help make those improvements while we can, when there's so much ability to grow. So early intervention is taking advantage of neuroplasticity. That's a big one. But another thing is, there may be a lot of follow-up appointments with pediatrician, neurologist, GI, all these specialists, but sometimes these appointments are infrequent. And so having an early intervention team, even if it's not PT, that's in regularly, really being there for the family, keeping an eye on that child, supporting the family and what they need. It makes sure that they have the support they need. 3 months don't go by with this concern that maybe a family has before it's addressed by the doctor. If an early intervention team is coming in, whether it's weekly, every other week, monthly, they're there to support them as often as possible. It helps create that support system, which is so important for many reasons, not just gross motor development or communication development or anything like that. Some of the specific benefits, in regards to PT with a child that's diagnosed with HIE, we focus a lot on musculoskeletal alignment. So we're addressing muscle tone, we're addressing strength, improving strength. We're helping manage abnormal muscle tone, possibly. We're looking for and addressing abnormal movement patterns. So we want to see, certain types of movements and certain progression. We are there again to help regularly monitor, giving the family a home exercise program. And that's not, necessarily do this many reps of this thing 3 times a day. It's how can we help your baby or your child help you sit themselves up after you change their diaper or after you do tube feeding. It's really working it into the family routine to make it helpful and not a burden. And then down the road, if needed, helping with things like orthotics and equipment needs, whether it's a wheelchair or a bath chair or a gait trainer. So yeah, that's kind of a little overview on that particular question. Do you have any on any of that?
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. So it just, in terms of, I'm hearing early intervention and PT mixed together, no matter what, neuroplasticity is kind of the key word. Rebuilding those roadways, that's amazing. And then just having the medical support you need along the way to monitor development is what I'm hearing. And then just help bridge the gap between when you're meeting with a provider and what you can do at home. And that's a huge thing for parents that we hear all the time in our support groups is, what should I be doing at home? There's always this, I could be doing more, I could be doing more. And just strike a balance between that. Yeah.
Sometimes feel like, you are. Yeah.
Yeah. When it comes to HIE specifically, what are some of the associated risks of HIE in relationship to developing conditions that do impact growth and fine motor development? Let's start there.
Yeah, so depending on where, the injury may have taken place, damage or injuries to certain areas of the brain, can affect different areas of development, as we know. Some areas are more gross motor, there's language areas of the brain, vision areas of the brain. So with gross motor and fine motor, if any of these pathways or areas are injured, then it can affect development in general. So you may see gross motor delays, fine motor delays, and these may be related to maybe abnormal muscle tone. And again, I don't want to get like too medical sounding, right. But if you picture kind of an analogy, if you picture a rubber band and say you're holding it in your fingers and you give it some tension, maybe that's kind of normal resting muscle tone. Well, sometimes those fingers are too close together and that muscle tone, or that rubber band is a little more loose and wiggly. Or sometimes those fingers are stretched too far apart and that rubber band is really, really tense. And so those muscle tone issues can come up sometimes, obviously, with HIE. So there's also there's an increased risk of developing cerebral palsy, which will, be diagnosed by a medical provider. But, as PTs, we do look for red flags and those things. That's something we're always kind of looking for and, trying to help manage if that's something that comes along with an HIE diagnosis. There's also an increased risk of seizures and infantile spasms. And unfortunately, those can be, cause additional damage, especially infantile spasms if they're not treated properly. And so these things kind of combined, if there's muscle tone abnormalities, if gross motor is, delayed, fine motor is delayed, can also lead to further things down the road. We're always, wanting to make sure that a child doesn't lose range of motion. If they have very high muscle tone and they have lost some range of motion and maybe they're in a position where, this muscle is shortened, we want to provide as much support as we can to maintain that range of motion so they don't develop a contracture or something down the road. So yeah, I mean, HIE, again, it's so different for every child, even if they have a very similar incident that caused the HIE to occur, it affects every child's brain differently. And again, it can affect any area of development. It can be gross motor, fine motor, it can be communication, it can be swallowing, it can be balance, vision. So we see a big range, which is kind of going back to the early intervention team, which is why it's so great to work with a team of multiple therapists, not just for the family, but for us as therapists. I love working with the OTs and the speech therapists and the feeding therapists that are part of my organization. It's so helpful to all work together because in the end, we're just trying to provide the best care for the child. And so working together, that's usually what will happen.
Yeah. So I know that, on a case-by-case basis, I'm sure answers vary, but is there like a standard of care in terms of like developmental milestones, like fine and gross motor milestones being measured? Like how often, when should that happen? How often, and who is typically in charge? And then what's the protocol after that?
Yeah. And, I'm not 100%, if it's a little bit different state to state, county to county.
Yeah.
Early intervention services and access to regional centers, who typically will provide those early intervention services, it varies pretty widely. Yeah. So, I'm not 100%, on how it is everywhere. Kind of what we see a lot of times is milestones are often measured. I mean, sometimes, pediatricians, even will do some kind of screening measures. If a child goes to a high-risk developmental follow-up, like my son would go, yearly, they would go through a whole list of tests for all the different areas of development to do those standardized measures. Here, we also have like the service coordinators through our regional center will do kind of like a screener, not necessarily conduct a full standardized measure, but they will kind of screen those areas. And that's sometimes where those delays are picked up. You know, a lot of times pediatricians' offices will have those questionnaires like, is your baby doing this, or is your toddler doing this? And that kind of tries to help pick up some of those things. As far as PT specific, whether it's insurance-based or it's through a high-risk clinic or it's early intervention, we will use standardized measures, something like the P-body or the GMFM. Those are just a couple of examples. And that will help you kind of get an idea of where those scores are age-wise, if you need to look at, you know, percentiles and things like that. We typically have been doing them annually. We're actually doing them every 6 months now through early intervention. So we will use a standardized measure to monitor that every 6 months right now. And then in the school system, typically when they turn 3, you know, they'll have standardized measures completed as they're being assessed. And then in the school system, they'll have their annual IEP meetings, but then they will have a triennial, which is every 3 years, and typically standardized measures are completed at those triennials. I do want to just touch on those, something that's really important to me.
Oh, yes, please.
On this. So as important as standardized measures are, I really honestly feel they do not always give an accurate picture of how well a child is doing or how much progress they've made. You know, for example, if they're struggling on stairs, maybe it's because they don't have any environmental exposure to stairs. You know, some areas of the country, a lot of 2-story. And so, you know, they may score low on a stairs skill, but it might just be because they haven't really had the experience. They also don't look really at quality of movement or how movement patterns have changed. And so those really fine details, you know, we might observe, but it won't necessarily show up on those. And so I always like to tell, you know, parents like to try and really focus on the changes we're seeing and the improvements we're seeing, no matter how small, no matter how slow. That's a huge one for me, because the standardized measures, as we know, they are important. But I don't want to use just that when I'm looking at how a child is doing.
Yeah. In the education world, which is something that I've been a part of for a long time, when it comes to like standardized measures, our thing was always one test is a screenshot. It's not a scrapbook. And you want a scrapbook of information.
I love that.
So I know. I feel like I have something to contribute to this conversation.
Yes, no,
I love that metaphor. Yeah,
because it's really hard, and honestly, it's affected me more after my experience with my own son, because you know, seeing those scores or taking those tests or answering those questions, it really affects you differently. And so from that parent side of it, you know, and who knows, like as we're going through school and, you know, school testing, like you said, like, you know, I'm trying to be very aware of, you know, if something or, you know, the scores don't look great, like, you know, don't focus just on that. Like say it again one more time for me.
It's not a screenshot. It should be a scrapbook of information.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I completely agree on that.
Yeah. So I heard you say, in terms of like early signs and symptoms of needing physical therapy services, you know, a while ago you were mentioning like abnormal muscle tone is one. What are some other signs and symptoms, like from a parent point of view, saying, I think I really should get my kid evaluated. This doesn't seem like it's entirely typical of development.
So some of the main ones, I wanted to make sure I didn't forget the ones that were really important to me to mention. I made a little, so sorry if I keep looking away.
I'm taking notes. So like
for our little ones, like our newborns, our babies, they should be moving. Lack of movement. So, you know, even if it's that fidgety and those little stretches and squeaks and that very uncontrolled fidgety movements, they should be moving. So lack of movement is a big one, especially for our newborns and our babies or infants. Increased stiffness. So you know, it's sometimes a little hard to tell with infants and babies and even toddlers when they start fighting you, but, you know, you're trying to get them dressed and, you know, sometimes they're not cooperating. So sometimes it's a little hard to tell, but if you're really noticing a lot of stiffness in that arm, trying to get into their onesie or their shirt, if you're noticing a lot of stiffness and tightness in their legs, trying to get that diaper through their legs when you're changing diapers, that is definitely something to bring up to your medical provider. On the opposite end, you know, babies are still developing trunk control and neck control and all of that. So babies are not going to have a super strong, you know, head control here, right? But if you're noticing that they are just really, really, and I don't really like the term floppy, but, you know, you hear that term a lot, you know, if it just seems like they're kind of on the opposite end, you know, they're not assisting at all. If they're on their tummy, they're not making an effort to kind of raise their head and at least clear their nose to be able to breathe. You know, you see even with a lot of newborns, you know, laying on mom's chest, maybe, or dad or whoever, you know, that little head bobbing, you know, that little muscle activation, that head bobbing. So you should see a little bit of that still. So if you're seeing that, again, there's like lack of movement or very little movement, or things just seem really, really loose, or the opposite, really, really stiff, those are some big ones. If you're noticing a strong rotation of their head to one side all the time, so, and this doesn't necessarily have to do with just HIE. Lots of babies with something called torticollis, which is
my baby had that.
Yeah. So you know all about, I'm sure, the stretching, the football holds, all of it. But you know, so if you're noticing they're always turned to one side, it could be something muscular. It could be something with vision. Hard to say. Another good thing to bring up to pediatrician or medical provider. Lack of use of one side, or kind of like neglecting one side, you know, say they get to maybe 6 months old and they're, you know, supposed to be kind of reaching for toys above, and you notice, you know, one arm's just kind of hanging out by body and it's always the other arm. Lack of using one side is a big one. We want to see both sides working together. We want to see both sides coming to midline eventually as it's age appropriate. And then something called primitive reflexes, which are these reflexes that our babies have. So one is called the Moro reflex or the startle reflex, where we get startled. Sometimes you're falling asleep and you feel yourself jump, you feel like you're falling. But that should integrate, which means go away, kind of disappear at like 2 to 4 months old. So if you have a 6-month-old who has a very severe startle reflex, where maybe they're hypersensitive and hyper-reactive to it, that would be something to bring up. Another one would be, it's called an ATNR. It's our asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. People sometimes say it looks like the baby is fencing, like the sport of fencing. So as they turn their head to one side, that arm will go out, the other arm will come here. If you're noticing that persist past 6 months old, which is when it should kind of disappear, that's kind of another, you know, thing that we would want to address. What can happen with these reflexes if they don't disappear, it can actually impact their ability to make progress with their physical development, gross motor, fine motor, and it can impact other areas of development too, you know, visual, you know, if they're kind of always looking to one side or they want to look this way, but one of their reflexes kick in. So those are some of the main ones.
Yeah, those are huge. And it just sounds like a lot of those early signs and symptoms are really things that you look out for in the first 6 months of life. Would you say that that's accurate? Because you mentioned 2, 4, and 6 months, but could it extend beyond that?
Those reflexes. Yeah. I mean, the other things, I mean, those are things from day one, really. Can kind of be observing. And it's hard as a first-time parent. Sometimes you don't know, and it's hard not to compare. Maybe, you know, well, my baby is not doing it, but my friend's baby is doing it. And there is a very wide range, you know, there's a range of what's normal, so to say. Yeah. And also just really listen to your instinct. You know, some people say it like mommy instinct, but I think it could be daddy instinct, grandma instinct, any instinct. You know, when you care for this human being, I really think there's something to say about that instinct inside of you. If something doesn't feel right or sit right, don't hesitate to bring it up. You know, don't feel silly to ask. If you feel like you're not being heard, ask to see someone else or keep pushing. You know, I really think there's something to be said about that. So that's a big thing too, that I tell parents, if you don't like the answer you got, keep pushing, keep asking. Yeah.
And I know before you also mentioned that it varies from state to state, and early interventions look different everywhere you go. But if you know that you need to begin PT services, does that typically, can you like safely say where that begins? Like, does it start with the pediatrician? Do pediatricians often refer?
Oftentimes. So, I mean, unfortunately, I think a lot of times early intervention services start too late. I do feel
Okay.
like things are hopefully getting better. I think, unfortunately, sometimes pediatricians don't know all the things that are out there to offer or what families can access. I do feel like, at least in our area, we are getting referrals sooner a lot of the times, which is great. But yes, it can definitely start with a pediatrician, you know, telling them you have concerns, asking if they can do a referral. Pediatricians can refer to the regional centers. You can also self-refer. I'm assuming that's across the board. I know here I did. You know, I when I had concerns about communication for my oldest, I was told, you know, oh, we don't usually, you know, we aren't too concerned about that until they're like closer to 3. And I knew, you know, that he could qualify. I knew enough that I was able to figure out, you know, he was pretty behind with his expressive communication. And so I just self-referred. So you can do that as well. And that may be email system. You can also, here at least, you can also just call the regional center and they'll get you set up to at least get the assessments going. So yeah, if someone unfortunately maybe has, you know, medical provider that's not being super supportive with that, I would highly encourage them to look into just contacting them, you know, the organization themselves and self-referring if needed.
Okay. And then in terms of like the scope of services provided, I mean, I think the most common misconception is that physical therapy is only for like, you know, like movements of like parts of your body. But I heard you mention before that it could be swallowing. I heard you mention something about vision. So like, what's the range of services that a physical therapist really realistically could provide a child?
So yeah, you know, for example, you mentioned feeding. So with feeding therapy, you know, you can go and get certified actually as, you know, PT or OT or speech. You mostly, well, at least here, we mostly see it with speech therapists and occupational therapists. But I will say that when we were in the NICU, our primary for our feeding plan and working on some of the swallow concerns was actually a PT. So yes, that's definitely an area. A lot of times we try to work together with a team. So if we know they're working on feeding therapy, we try to work with them to see what can we do in PT, whether it's with strengthening or positioning or whatever, to help support that particular area. Same thing with vision. I mean, vision and physical development have such a huge connection. And so a lot of times, honestly, I will just give families recommendations on asking, you know, whether I have concerns with maybe inner ear or hearing, or maybe I'm feeling like something's going on with vision. I will highly encourage them to ask to have referrals to those specialists, because all of those things, you know, intertwine together. And I'm definitely not a specialist in it. And so I will, you know, suggest that they have those things looked into, because if maybe there's something going on with vision and we don't know, you know, we may not make progress on a certain skill if the vision's really impacting it. But yeah, a lot of it is, you know, the things that most people hear about: strengthening, working on balance, working on postural control, musculoskeletal alignment. So working on getting good alignment in order to get, you know, the best type of movements out of it that we can. Sometimes we'll utilize different modalities. You know, we have different modalities. Like we, at our previous site where I work, which I loved, we had a warm water therapy pool. So we used water as a modality. Yeah, I love working with like OTs to work on some of the sensory and proprioceptive and all of that together, because that's nice to co-treat sometimes as well for some of those areas that maybe go a little bit more into like the OT realm or something. Did I answer your question? Sorry.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, that was amazing. And I know that we're going to be talking about resources at the end, but you did mention water modality. And there was a woman in our chat who said, you know, do you have any resources for like aqua therapy ideas? I put you on the spot. Do you have some of those that come to mind?
Nothing that pops into my mind right away, but I can send you some information that maybe we can add to like the write-up.
That's what we'll do. Yeah. So that would be amazing. You can email me and then I will add it to our blog and I'll add it to our social key takeaways. That would be perfect. Yeah.
It's because I've come across things here and there where there's like handouts of different, with pictures of like different activities. Do. But yeah, let me take a look if we could find just like an actual website or,
that would be cool.
That would be awesome.
That would be amazing.
Videos are nice too. Like if we could find something, we'll see. Most of the home exercise program, like resources, like websites that I've used in the past, I don't really see a whole lot of warm water therapy or aqua therapy on there. Also, I do feel like I also recently came across, like, I think it was just online. I think it was like a pre-recorded or something, but it was like about using aqua therapy or water therapy in pediatrics for gross motor development. And, anybody could, sign up and watch that live or not. I don't think it was live, but watch that webinar as well. So yeah, we'll look and try and find something.
That would be great. And just because we are kind of talking about things to do at home, that's kind of the next question anyway, which is like, what advice would you give to parents, caregivers, or family members, or anyone who's trying to support their child to help them foster gross or fine motor movement at home?
So we try our best to really work it into their daily routine. And we don't want it, like I said, I think earlier, we don't want it to become a burden. Of course, certain activities are going to be difficult for the child. They may fuss through it a bit. It might be hard, but we don't want it to become something that they dread doing. You want to make it as enjoyable as possible. For a parent and a child to do together, or grandparent or whoever the caregiver is, trying to find ways to work it into the routine. So a lot of times we'll use diaper changes, because if a parent is feeling like, oh, I can't sit down and do this for a half an hour, if the child's being changed at least 5 times a day, for example, well, if you do it at every diaper change, then at least they were able to do it 5 times that day. And sometimes that's the best way for it to work. After bath time, while walking around the house. So maybe you're working on some kind of, trunk strengthening activity or neck strengthening activity while you're carrying them around the house and looking in the mirrors or playing peekaboo with a sibling. So that's, those are kind of some of the things we try and consider. I love trying to help families figure out how to utilize things around the house that they already have. So, whether it's toys or things that they have or just random household items. COVID, one thing out of COVID was doing everything via teletherapy. We really got creative with just things around the house. And so we found ways, therapeutic ways of using, Dollar Tree pool noodles, laundry baskets, step stools, a long scarf or a long blanket, diaper boxes, even an old one, and you just stuff old clothes that the child grew out of into it to weight it down, a bag of uncooked rice or canned goods. These are all examples of things. One thing I could also provide too, if you think it might be something people would be interested in, we started to make a list of different household items and how you could use it. Like if you're working on walking, but you want that child's arms to be free to work on balance, you can use a long scarf around the chest if you don't want to have to buy, something called walking. There's something called Walking Wings that does something similar. But if you don't want to purchase that, or you can't, there's no reason you need to. You can use a scarf, around home.
I love that.
Or a furniture dolly if you're working on crawling and you want them to be able to just work on moving their knees forward and kind of give their arms a break, using a furniture dolly or a scooter board and putting their hands on top of that so they can just slide it along while they're working on legs. So I can also try and share that document with you, because I had coworkers that came up with really cool stuff. It's like, oh, I never thought to use it that way. Like just 2 weeks ago, I use diaper boxes a lot, but I actually had a coworker, she took the big sleeve of diapers out, still in the plastic. They didn't have a scooter board. And because it's slippery with the plastic, the baby put their hands on that and slid it forward as they were working on crawling their little legs forward.
I'm all about inclusivity and accessibility. So that makes me, that's just brilliant. And I feel like a lot of the things that you're saying too are to really embed those things into your daily routine is an amazing piece of advice, an amazing strategy, because burnout is real. Early intervention burnout is so real. And, you know, you're overwhelmed, and, you know, as we've seen here today, like nothing goes,
Right.
you know, so like,
Right.
yeah, but you have to change a diaper, you
Right.
know, so
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. So that's a big thing. I mean, I feel like, yeah, the therapist that I work with, like that's a really huge focus for all of us, which is awesome. I feel like we're all on the same page. And so we're all supportive of that with the family. And I think too, just some advice, you know, giving to families, like, you're doing amazing. Like you're doing
yeah,
amazing, whatever you're doing, whether it's a lot or a little, it's all helping. It's all amazing.
yeah,
You know, it's really hard not to feel like you could be doing more. Am I doing enough? I should have done this. I'll be honest, when my son was in, like, for example, speech therapy, you know, they give you your homework, and I'm a therapist and I give homework,
yeah,
but I was the worst one at doing the homework. Like, I'll be honest, Wednesday morning would come, that's when she would come, and it'd be, you know, 20 minutes before, and I'd be like, we did not do our homework at all this last week.
yeah,
It is really hard, you know, whether you're working in the home, out of the home, if you're working as a stay-at-home parent, it's a lot. And what, you know, giving yourself grace is huge.
yeah,
Giving yourself some, you know, be easy on yourself. You know, if you
yeah,
didn't do anything yesterday or today, maybe your goal is just do a little bit tomorrow.
right,
And like I said, you know, one of our big roles is trying to help you find ways to work it into your routine
yeah,
so that it's not a burden and so that you don't dread it. I mean, you should be able to hopefully find ways where it's like, you know, fun,
yeah,
enjoyable time, you know, with your little one.
yeah. And yeah, use it as a bonding moment with them too.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Best as you can. I mean, it's hard. You know, none of us go into parenthood thinking you want to also be their therapist, you know.
no, yeah,
Um, but you know, that's what happens for some of us,
hmm,
and we just do our best.
yeah. I know I went a little bit out of order, but we have two more questions. The first of which is, what are some like long-term or longitudinal outcomes that are associated with receiving physical therapy services and HIE? Like, are there long-term benefits? That's really what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah. So one of the big things, you know, that I mentioned was capitalizing on our neuroplasticity. So building those connections and making those connections really strong. You know, if that injury is going to put that child at risk of abnormal movement patterns, abnormal tone that may lead to decreased range of motion or contractures, you know, our job is to try and give that child the best quality of life possible. And so if we can maintain their range of motion, prevent contractures, you know, prevent surgeries, that is a huge thing. I don't know the actual study. I just actually learned this in a class that I was in earlier this week for a couple of days. There was a study that the instructors had found, and we're talking about that for every dollar spent, it was in the UK, first of all, I'll put that out there, but for every dollar spent for early intervention services, it saved $7 for school-based services.
Wow.
The representation of like, and it's not just about, and you know, you can take the money part out of it, but you could even look at it as just like time or effort or whatever, you know, that putting that into the early intervention really long term does play a huge role. You know, I've had a lot of therapists I've talked to where they really, because that child was able to get into early intervention, you know, a good equipment they needed or whatever it was, they were able to avoid, you know, certain surgeries down the line. And so that's huge. You know, that is always great when we can do that. And we can't always, you know, there's going to be times where, you know, no matter what intervention you do, they may have some kind of complication or there might be some kind of surgery needed down the road. But that's our goal, is to do as much as we can now to make it better for them
later.
Yeah.
I love it. And then this is what we love ending our Q&As with, and our parents and community members really appreciate it too, is just hearing straight from the horse's mouth, tools or resources that you'd recommend for, you know, for our HIE community to learn more about or better understand physical therapy or early intervention as a whole. So we'd love to hear anything you have to provide.
Yeah, so it was a little hard because it's like, I don't know where everyone's at. And so every county is so different. So the big one just for early intervention in general, to find out what services are in your area. Because, where I'm at, we also have a discipline that's child development. There's child development specialists, and their focus is like social, emotional, like play therapy. And I don't know if they have that everywhere. I'm not sure, to be honest. And so reaching out to your local regional centers to find out what is available and what's offered. Here in the Northern California area, we have something called Warm Line. And that's actually a resource for families that have children that are, receiving services and have, and it's run by families who themselves personally have experienced it, have been part of that. And so that's great. There's resources, everything from what happens in early intervention, what happens when your child turns 3, different sources for childcare, especially if they have medical needs. Maybe you need to send your child to childcare, but they, they have a trach or they have a G-tube or something. Support groups, I feel like, are huge. That's honestly been probably the biggest one for me personally. And I've heard that from a lot of families too, whether it's specific to HIE or cerebral palsy or early intervention or not. I mean, there's so many different support groups out there. I think there's something huge just with being able to talk to people that are on the same path as you. You might veer off the road a little bit. They might veer off a little bit this way, but you're all kind of on the same path, the same road. And then there were a couple of websites that I found that I think were just kind of overall, in general, kind of what early intervention is and kind of support for families. One was parentcenterhub.org, and one was 0to3.org, spelled out. There's also been some amazing like Instagram pages, honestly, that I've found with physical therapists, occupational therapists that just are really fun, and they give out or they share content regularly just on different things you can try at home and fun activities, information like that. I couldn't find, there wasn't like a specific one, but if you were to look up like a hashtag of like pediatric physical therapy or something like that, there's some really awesome therapists on there sharing all kinds of info. Yeah.
No, those are great. And I know you and I will talk after, and I'd love to get anything that you find maybe on that, like aqua therapy. And then I know you also mentioned that document about like household items that you can use to support and foster growth. So I'll get those from you after this, and I'll make sure to put them in the blog on our website and our key takeaways as well. So I think we covered everything in our comments and also in our preset questions. And just thank you so much, Ashley, for your time and for your flexibility and patience as we work through the technological issues too. You're such a trooper.
Thank you for letting me be the one to come and talk about this. Yeah, it's a little nerve-wracking because, even practicing for over 10 years, you kind of feel like, do I really know what I'm doing? Am I really good at what I'm doing? Am I giving the right info?
No, imposter syndrome is real everywhere, isn't it?
So hard. But so I really appreciate it. And if anyone has any specific questions after the fact, you can feel free to, pass on my email address, or you could give me their contact info. I don't know if I'll be able to answer it, but if I can't answer it, I will find the answer because I work with an amazing team, many of which have even more experience than me. So
I love it. Thank you. You did amazing. Thank you so much for helping us and providing us with your insight and wisdom on all of this. And I hope you go on to enjoy your Friday. And thank you everyone in our community who joined in and asked questions. I will have all of this posted and ready to go over the weekend, and your key takeaways and blog will be ready by early next week. So thank you. Goodbye to you, Ashley, and goodbye everyone. We'll see you again soon.
Bye.